Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Sarah Williams. I'm the director at Becker School, and I'm so glad that you are all here to learn about the COVID-19 vaccine that will be coming out for children 6 months to 5 years. I am thrilled that Dr. King has graciously offered to be with us this evening. Dr. King is an associate professor of pediatric infectious disease at Baylor College of Medicine, where she is also part of the faculty for the Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine Center, the Center for Cell and Gene Therapy, and the graduate programs in immunology, developmental biology, and translational biology, and molecular programs in immunology. Molecular medicine, sorry. A native Houstonian, Dr. King received her BA in biochemical science from Harvard University and her MD and PhD degrees from Washington University in St. Louis. She is married and has an 8-year-old daughter. Thank you for being with us, Dr. King. I am going to give you the floor for your presentation, and then we will do a little Q&A at the end.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for inviting me to come this evening. It's great to have a chance to talk to you all this evening, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions, if I can, that you might have. Of course, there's been some news recently about vaccination for children under 5, and I know people have a lot of questions, so I'm hoping to answer some of those for you today. Sarah just told you about my background. I am a pediatric infectious disease physician and see patients at Texas Children's. So my job is to keep kids safe from infections. Went to school for a really long time, studying microbiology, medicine, and now run a research lab which actually is focused on bone marrow and bone marrow responses to infections. So I have taken care of kids with COVID-19 in the hospital. And I would just say that while I am not personally involved in any of the vaccine trials or personally involved in COVID-19 research, my research that I do is really helpful in helping me understand the studies about COVID-19 and the vaccine trials. So this is just a little bit of statistical update about COVID-19 in kids under 5. As of February 23rd, so last week, there were 2 million reported cases of COVID-19 among children under 5 in the United States, with 307 deaths. As you all know, the majority of kids with COVID-19 have a very mild illness, body aches, congestion, some fever that typically resolves in a few days. We recommend 10 days of isolation for kids who are infected, and sometimes the isolation is the worst part. But a subset of kids will have more like long COVID symptoms, brain fog, sometimes cardiac side effects, and prolonged respiratory symptoms. You've heard about that there are a minority of kids that can still have severe illness. So 113,000 kids have been hospitalized. That's kids under 5 have been hospitalized with COVID-19 since May of 2020. So comes out to about 1 in 100 cases that end up being severe enough to require hospitalization. And while a lot of those are kids that are predisposed to more severe infection and may have pre-existing conditions, it's not certainly not all of them. And we've had perfectly healthy kids also have severe disease and die from COVID-19. You've heard about the syndrome MIS-C, which is multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children. This is still not very well understood inflammatory syndrome that follows COVID-19 by a few weeks. And as of January 31st, there were 6,851 cases of MIS-C in children in the United States, with 59 deaths. The reason that this syndrome is important to mention is that it tends to be quite severe, and about half of those kids require ICU admission. And 20% of those have been in the 1 to 4-year-old age range. Okay, so the vaccine, I have some slides later that I can show you about really explaining how the vaccine works, but I suspect that most of you already know that. So I'll just jump to, how effective is it in the pediatric population? And just to remind you what we know about the 5 to 11-year-old age group, the initial studies, which were met with great excitement, showed that the Pfizer vaccine was 91% effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19 infection in children aged 5 to 11 years old. And that study was done between May and September of last year, when the Delta variant was common. So unfortunately, just 2 days ago, on February 28th, a new study came out looking at protection in this age group, in the 5 to 11-year-old age group, provided by the Pfizer vaccine. And it was much, much lower in the months of December and January, December 2021, and then January 2022. So in other words, during the Omicron surge, the vaccine efficacy has been much, much less among this 5 to 11-year-old age group. This is, so we also saw lower efficacy of the vaccine in adults. Wasn't quite so bad as 12%. So that's a bit disheartening. The vaccine did remain 48% effective at preventing hospitalization during this time in this study. So I guess one thing to say about this is that, I think we've become accustomed to a very high standard right now for what we expect out of the vaccines. The vaccines really were designed to prevent hospitalization and death. And it was just kind of a extra bonus that they have been so effective at actually preventing even symptomatic infection. And so while this is very disappointing that it was only 12% among the 5 to 11-year-old age group, we should remember that that's actually wasn't what the vaccines were designed for, and it was really more to prevent hospitalization. And it seems still at least somewhat effective in that realm. But I do think this is an indicator that we're going to be needing boosters for the kids as well. So studies have shown that among adolescents, vaccination is effective in preventing MIS-C. So that's excellent. And then among adults, we know that boosting, in addition to the first 2 doses of vaccination, really helps to overcome the deficit that we see with Omicron. And so that with boosting, you get the antibodies back up to levels that are highly effective against hospitalization. And we've seen that throughout the Omicron wave, that the vast majority of people hospitalized or dying from Omicron are unvaccinated individuals. Okay, so what is the delay in the under 5 age group? To explain this, I'm going to back up for a second and just explain how the study is being conducted. So right now, approximately 8,300 children have been enrolled in the pediatric Pfizer phase 1, 2, 3 trials. And that is in this 6-month to under 12 age group. So the way they say this is under 12 means up to 11 years, 364 days. And that's in the US, and actually a lot of the US studies have been done here in Houston, and then also in several countries in Europe. The study was designed to start with the older age group and then move down as we gathered data of the older kids to move down to the younger age groups. And as you know, the vaccine was given authorization for the 5 to under 12-year-olds on October 29th of last year. So how the kids in this trial are divided into different age ranges that are getting different doses. So in order to explain how these doses are determined, I'm going to show you some data from a published study about the Moderna trial. So this is not referring to the Pfizer data or the pediatric trials, but this is just example data from the Moderna trial that shows how you find the right dose. So in the Moderna trial, they tried 3 different doses in the phase 1 trial. And this is showing 25 micrograms, 100 micrograms, and 250 micrograms. And one of the things that they're looking for in finding the right dose is safety and tolerability. And so I'm not showing you the data about safety, meaning like severe adverse events, but of which there have been very, very few. But in terms of tolerability, we're looking at these kinds of symptoms like arthralgia or pain in the joints, fatigue, fever, and chills. So these are some of the most common adverse symptoms that occur commonly after the vaccinations. And you can see that mild is gray, moderate is blue, and severe is yellow. After the first dose at these different dose levels, you see some mild to moderate symptoms. And then after the second dose, as many of us experienced, there were more, right? And you can see that, in fact, at the 250 microgram dose, there was more of these yellow bars where there was people having really severe fatigue or severe chills. And as you can expect, that's more common in the very high doses. Okay, so looking at this data, the people doing the trial may say, there's going to be a problem with tolerability at the 250 microgram dose. The other thing, of course, that's important in the vaccine trials is efficacy. And efficacy in the initial part of the trial is based on how much antibody you produce in response to the vaccine. So this is a graph that shows inhibitory dilution 50. So basically higher up on the scale means more antibody. And even though our immune system has many different arms that we use to fight against infections, many people have now shown that antibody levels are a good surrogate measure for how the immune system is functioning as a whole. So the more antibodies we have, the more effective the vaccine is. Now, this is a log-based 2 scale. So every notch here gives you kind of twice as much antibody. So you can see that here in the days after the second dose of the 250 microgram dose, you're getting a very high level of antibody here by day 36 or day 43. And then if you look here at the 100 microgram dose, so a much lower dose comparatively, but you're still getting quite high antibody levels. And then by contrast, down here at the 25 microgram dose, it really was quite a bit lower. So these are the kinds of data that the folks in the vaccine trial will look at and say, hey, we really needed 100 micrograms to get to a good antibody response level. And we didn't gain that much by going all the way up to 250, but we got a lot of side effects and tolerability issues at 250. And so this is the kind of data that ends up in the selection of 100 microgram dosing. And that is actually what the Moderna adult dose is that is given to people. I just want to point out here that over here on the far right of this figure is convalescent titer. What this means is this is how much antibody people had who had naturally been infected with SARS-CoV-2. So as you can see, this is kind of an interesting point that natural infection did not give you better antibody levels. In fact, half of these people had much lower antibody levels than the people compared to the people who got vaccinated. So this is the kind of data that supports the idea that the vaccines actually work better and more reliably to induce antibody levels than natural infection. Okay, so going back to the original point. So in the children, those children in the Pfizer trial have been divided into 3 age groups, 6 months to under 2, 2 months to under, or 2 years to under 5, and then 5 years to under 12. And so I already told you that this group has already been authorized and have already been receiving vaccines at the 10 microgram dose. So 10 micrograms is 1/3 of the adult dose. 30 micrograms is what the adults have gotten, and also the adolescents. So teenagers have been getting 30 micrograms. The younger kids have been getting a dose of 3 micrograms. And when so far, according to Pfizer's report, although the data are not publicly available, the 6 month to under 2-year-old group has had a very good response to the vaccine. It's been safe, it's been tolerable, and the antibody levels have been good. So check this box. However, the problem has been in this middle age group. So the 2 to under 5-year-old age group receiving 3 micrograms, it's been safe, it's been tolerable. However, the antibody levels have been subpar. So the way this is written in the Pfizer report was that the antibody and the responses in this 2 to under 5-year-old age group were not as high as the expected standards, which were set to be the amount of antibody made by 16 to 25-year-olds receiving an adult dose. So that was what the study was aiming for. And unfortunately, this vaccine dose was insufficient to meet that standard. So so this was realized back in December during a sort of interim analysis of the data. And in response to this, Pfizer announced that they were going to add a 3rd dose to this pediatric study. So for this, they have added a 3rd 3 microgram dose 2 months following the 2nd dose. And the results of that are expected in April. And I suspect that after the 3rd dose, then you're going to have high antibodies. So of course, the natural question is that you're wondering, why didn't they just switch to 5 micrograms or 8 micrograms, right? And the answer to that is probably twofold. I'm speculating here. One is that it may be that the tolerability of the higher doses was not good in this age group. And so, you know, that's just like, you don't want to produce a vaccine that people won't take because they have such severe fever or other issues with it. The other is that if they, at this point in the study, switched to an entirely different dose, you'd have to start over, right? So you'd have to enroll a whole new set of kids, start with dose 1, then dose 2, and observe for 2 months. And so it would actually delay things even more. So it's sort of the most efficacious way to move this forward was to add a 3rd dose and move forward. And this is the kind of data that gives us reason to believe that a 3rd dose is going to work. And I'll explain this, but the bottom line is that the spacing of the doses matters. And so in green, what you'll see is that this is the vaccine interval. So if vaccination 1 and 2 were given 8 to 12 weeks apart, then, sorry, this is the antibody level after the 1st dose, and this is the antibody level after the 2nd dose. If those are given 8 to 12 weeks apart, you get this amount of antibody. If the 2 doses are given 15 to 25 weeks apart, you get higher amount of antibody after the 2nd dose. And if the 2 doses are given like almost a year apart, you get an even higher level. And you can see this is a log scale. So these differences are pretty big. So I don't think anybody can really explain well enough the immune system to know why this is exactly, but we do know that antibody responses are better if there's a longer interval between booster shots, if you will, between vaccine doses. And so essentially what's being achieved now in the 2 to 5-year-old age group is lengthening the interval between the 1st dose and the 3rd dose with the expectation that that's going to actually improve this response. So what does this mean? It means that if things go as expected, and that's if, then data will be available in April, and then you might expect a potential authorization to move forward in May. The total time to be fully vaccinated according to this schedule then will be 13 weeks, because now we have 3 shots. They're given at 0, 3, and 11 weeks. And then you need 2 more weeks to get full antibody production after that 3rd shot. So if I'm just projecting here, if everything goes according to the plan, then you might see an authorization in May, and it would take until August to really go through these 3 shots and get all your antibody levels up. So that's the meat of the data I wanted to show you. Why get vaccinated? The vaccines do protect from severe COVID, from hospitalization and death from COVID, from long COVID and MIS-C. We want to protect vulnerable individuals in our community. And, we know that even though kids tend to not have severe illness from COVID, they can spread it. And we know that little kids are great vectors for respiratory diseases. And so by vaccinating them, we're really contributing to the entire community staying well. And the more we can do that, the more we can interrupt transmission, and the more we can help prevent the rise of new variants and future waves. And with the 5 to 11-year-old group, as I said, the efficacy seems to be lower, but we do know that vaccinated people are infectious for fewer days. So it still helps in terms of reducing transmission. Okay, so that's really all that I was going to say, and let you ask questions to sort of drive the remainder of the conversation. Here are some general questions that I've been asked that I'm happy to answer if you have them, or if you have your own questions, I'm happy to hear them.
Thank you, Catherine. And I will let, if people want to put questions in the chat or here in a minute, we can probably just show video if we want to ask you a question. I did just get a question that came in my email, Catherine, and so I'll ask you this. It says, a pediatrician I spoke with said from her anecdotal evidence, from her personal experience and not science-based, she sees that under 5-year-olds are not spreading it to each other or to adults. When a younger child receives COVID, they get it from an adult or older child. Is that what you have found also? Or have you heard anything similar, or have you heard that this is not true?
Great question. There have been studies, and I think that there's not really very definitive studies yet, but we do know that it's possible for kids under 5 to infect those around them, including adults. And I know that based on case reports and specific instances where we know that the child was infected first and then passed on to other family members, for example, or school, like teachers at schools. So it is possible for the under 5-year-old age group to pass the infection, to transmit it. I think that the data is still evolving for how much does this occur relative to, let's say, the flu, right? Where we know that flu is very significantly passed around by little kids to each other and to adults around them. So I don't know I can't tell you what is the relative transmissibility of COVID compared to something like flu or adenovirus. But that's been one of the things about Omicron, right, is that it's been highly transmissible. And we do know that the viral load in the noses and the throats of young kids is as high as can be seen in adults. I think you'll see people say that, well, kids, we know from, say, research in tuberculosis that little kids don't transmit tuberculosis as much as adults because they don't generate as strong of a cough as older people. But I think we just don't know that yet about COVID. So I see that there's a couple of questions in the chat. So I will answer them here. The first one is, what is the hospitalization rate for unvaccinated children under 5? So I think the best data I can give you, that information that I showed you was 113,000 children hospitalized in the United States. The rate, I think comes out to about 1 in 100 kids that are infected. And so it's low, but it's not zero. And what is the plan for, the next question is, what is the plan for 4-year-olds? Our daughter will turn 5 in January. Would it make more sense to wait until she's 5 to get the higher dose or get vaccinated sooner at the lower dose? So actually, hi, Marissa, it's good to see you. I know, Marissa. Actually, the dose for under 2 and the dose for 2 to 4 is the same, but yes, it goes up at 5. So this is really interesting because I was asked the same question back in October when the vaccine was approved for the 12 and up group, and there were a lot of 11-year-olds who said, should I get it now or should I wait until I turn 12 so I can get the adult dose? And I would say that actually, given this new data about the efficacy at the lower doses, there's good reason to think that the higher dose is going to be more effective. That is not the answer that I gave in October. At that time, I said, this is what's approved, just get the vaccine, it's highly effective. And it was for Delta. But now with Omicron, it makes a difference. So I think that in this sense, it is, if it's close, what you're weighing is probably you will get a better response at the higher dose. But if you delay, then you're spending more time unvaccinated. So in a sense, the decision rests with what is the prevalence of the infection in our community. And if the prevalence is very low, then you might feel comfortable waiting so that you can ultimately kind of get the higher dose and more immunity. But I would say that if we're having a very high transmission rate, then I would just go ahead and get whatever you can. Keep in mind that we're going to continue to see boosters recommended. And so let's say you go ahead and start getting your 4-year-old vaccinated as soon as it's available, then likely she'll turn 5 and you'll get the booster at the higher dose, and that would work well. So that's another way to look at it. I'm going to stop sharing because then maybe I can see people.
All right, I have another question, Catherine, from a parent. It says, if a male child has family heart issues that run on the paternal side, great-grandfather had heart attacks, grandfather heart attack, and quad bypass at 40, father's being monitored at 35. Would you rethink on giving the child the vaccine with myocarditis possibly affecting the younger population? The father is vaccinated, but the mother is highly nervous about giving the son the vaccination with heart history.
Okay, great. Okay, so first of all, my disclaimer is I can't give anybody very specific medical advice, right? This is rather a specific medical question. But I will say in general, to address this question of myocarditis. So yes, myocarditis has been the most significant and most reported adverse effect of the mRNA vaccines so far. And I actually got the data here so I could really answer this question. So this was looked at very carefully by the CDC, and the risk is among adolescent boys, about 1 in 14,500. 1 in 14,500 males between the ages of 12 to 17 have gotten myocarditis. What myocarditis is inflammation of the heart, and it can cause symptoms like a feeling of a racing heart, fluctuations in blood pressure. These symptoms have resulted in some hospitalizations and close monitoring of these kids. None of the cases have resulted in death, and none of the cases have resulted in long-term health problems. So in other words, those kids were monitored, they may or may not have been treated with steroids, and then the issues have resolved and there were no long-term effects. So that is now a known, potential adverse effect from the mRNA vaccines. And when the CDC looked at that really carefully, what they concluded was that they still recommended the vaccine, and that is because these effects were manageable, and also because the risk of heart problems from COVID have been much higher than the risk of heart problems from the vaccine. And so the data is that, for example, 1 in 3,000 people with COVID may have the MIS-C syndrome and myocarditis associated with that. So in fact, the risk of having heart problems from COVID outweighs the risk of having heart problems from the vaccine. So I think that what that means for a family that's concerned about heart problems is that the balance is that you still want to get the vaccine, because especially if you're worried about heart problems, you really, really don't want to get COVID. Okay, so the next question I see in the chat is, are the age thresholds based on weight and size of the child or the maturity of the immune system, or neither? Just wondering how they determine dosages. So this is a great question and a well-informed one, because I remember when the 5 to 11-year-old vaccine was authorized in October, this question came up a lot. And in fact, there was news reports that said, remember, vaccine doses are not based on size, they're based on the maturity of the immune system. And there is some basis for saying that, because our immune systems are really great when we're young, and our young bodies are primed to see infectious agents, present them to the immune system, and mount antibody responses. So, because that's how things happen naturally. And so we have a very strong repertoire of tools in our immune system that really produce good antibody and other immune responses when we're young. And those capabilities degrade over time as we age. So from that perspective, it makes sense that maybe you would need a smaller dose for a younger person. However, now we have good evidence that the 5 to 11-year-old vaccines have not been as effective. And if you just compare how the 11-year-olds have done with how the 12-year-olds have done, which is not going to be a significant difference in size or age, the 12-year-olds have had a much higher and more robust antibody response. So this suggests that size matter, or that, that size matters maybe to more extent than we were giving it credit before, and sort of assuming that younger kids are just going to have that much stronger response was over ambitious maybe. So in other words, the data now show that the dose does matter, and basically we're having to navigate between what's tolerable and what's effective. And certainly, as you could imagine, having a higher dose does lead to more side effects, more injection site pain, more fever, and those kinds of issues. And so it's really a trade-off, which I think is now being offset by more doses. And I'll remind everybody that many of the routine childhood vaccines that we all get are a 3-dose series. So hepatitis, Haemophilus, influenza, the pneumococcal vaccine, they're 3-dose series. Okay. Next question is, what is the data regarding immunity passed on to babies from their pregnant mothers? Is there a best time to get a booster while pregnant? Would getting a booster in the 3rd trimester provide the most protection to a newborn? Thank you for asking this question. And actually, we do have data. There was data just about a month ago, a study looking at protection of babies, comparing the rate of infection in babies under 6 months between mothers who had been vaccinated and who had not been. And I actually reviewed this paper. The study was done during this time interval where all the babies that were born to mothers who were vaccinated during pregnancy because the vaccine had only just become available. And so, first of all, bottom line was that yes, vaccination during pregnancy was highly protective against infection in the infants under 6 months. So that's fantastic. I'm not remembering exactly right now the exact number, but it was highly protective. And then the question about whether it's better to be in the 1st trimester or early in pregnancy. I believe that if I remember correctly, the data was a little bit stronger for people who were vaccinated later in the pregnancy. Now, it had to be at least 2 weeks before the baby was born. So you need, that's the standard thing, is you need about 2 weeks to make antibodies after a vaccination. So as long as it's 2 weeks before the baby is born, it seemed like there was a little bit of a benefit for the latter part of the pregnancy as compared to the early. But really, it was effective and helpful for all of those babies. And what was notable to me about that study was when they tracked, it was something like 150 babies with COVID. A couple of them had really extreme illness in the ICU. One child died. The ones with severe illness were all born to unvaccinated mothers. So there was a strong protection against the severe infections and severe outcomes. Okay, so also pregnancy related is, does breastfeeding help protect the infant? And how much protection does this give? I don't think I've seen a study about this for COVID yet. So I cannot give you definitive data, but this information, so, what the study that I just cited about vaccination during pregnancy indicates is that antibodies do travel across the placenta and get to the infant and protect the infant for the first 6 months of life. We know for other kinds of infections that antibodies are passed through breast milk to infants. And so I would expect that there is a protection, but I think I don't have definitive evidence of that so far. But I would expect the answer is yes. And I don't know how much. Again, I don't have concrete data. Okay, the next question is also about pregnancy. If the mother got the booster before she got pregnant, will there be a recommendation for a 4th booster, or is the baby protected already? Okay, we don't have this data. So as I mentioned, the study that just came out last month was the first wave of data that we have, which was mothers that were vaccinated during pregnancy and then following up those babies for the first 6 months of life. So just not enough time has passed yet for us to be able to compare mothers who got pregnant during the phase when they were getting boosted or were due for a booster. That study just hasn't been done yet. So I won't know. So I think this all gets back to how long do antibodies last, right? And that's sort of the critical question to really answer your question, which is, if antibodies last a year, then you're good. Or if they last 5 years, they're good. But if antibodies decay quickly, like within 6 months after a booster shot, then that means that we kind of have to keep getting boosters every 6 months. So I think to try to answer that question a bit, we do know that the immune system has lots of different arms. And as I mentioned during the talk, antibodies are used as a surrogate measure. It's an easy thing to measure for how well our immune system is doing. But it's not the only thing we have. We also have T cells that have a long-term memory. And so I would say that for your average person walking around, even after your antibody levels have decayed and dropped to low levels, you still have other weapons in your armamentarium to fight infection, and it probably still protects you against severe disease. Now, that wouldn't really help during a pregnancy, because during the pregnancy, we are depending on antibodies to cross the placenta to protect the infant. So I don't have concrete data about that, but I won't be surprised if that's going to continue. That may end up being a recommendation that you should get a booster when you're pregnant to protect the infant. And we see that for pertussis right now, right? Like everybody is recommended to get a Tdap booster when they're pregnant to protect against whooping cough or pertussis for the baby. Okay, next question is, if you get your preschooler fully vaccinated, how long will the vaccine status last? Will they need more than the initial 2 to 3 doses, and will it be like the flu vaccine yearly? Right, so I've kind of addressed that a little bit. Yeah, I mean, this is something that we knew about coronaviruses even at the start of the pandemic, is that famously the antibodies that our bodies make against coronaviruses don't last very long. And so it was actually really encouraging with the Delta wave that there were many studies that showed that vaccine protection against COVID was still very strong 8 months and 11 months after infection. That was before Omicron. So actually the antibodies are lasting, but the virus is changing, and that's our major problem, our major hurdle. So because Omicron came around and it had so many mutations in it that were in the spike protein of the virus, it evaded the antibody response, even though the antibodies were still there. They were just targeted to the wrong thing now. So our bigger concern is new variants. So basically the question about how often we're going to have to be boosted or how frequently we're going to need to have vaccines depends on how quickly we're seeing new variants. And this depends on the world getting vaccinated, right? So if we can get the world vaccinated, then we'll really tamper down the emergence of new variants. If we're still stuck like we are right now, where 30% of the world is vaccinated, then we're going to keep seeing new variants. And I think that's the big question right now. Hopefully they'll start spacing out, but as you've probably heard, like I have, there's already some other variant of Omicron that's been detected that could be a problem. So, I think we don't know yet, but the likelihood is that we're going to see more waves and we're going to see more variants, and we're going to continue to have to adjust the vaccines to meet those. The good thing is that the mRNA technology is very easy to tweak. And so it doesn't take a super long time to then develop a variant of the vaccine, and that we can respond quickly to new variants by doing that. But I know we all hope that we, as collectively as a people, can all pull together and get vaccinated so that we don't all have to keep chasing these variants.
And then I have a question that I received from a parent. She wanted to know if you could elaborate on if and when Moderna's pediatric COVID vaccine will be announced or advanced.
Okay, I don't know exactly. My daughter is in the Moderna vaccine, full disclosure. So I know that it's been underway for some time, and they should probably have data now, essentially, for the pediatric, at least 5 and over age group. what I can tell you is that if you recall, when the adolescent vaccine was approved for Pfizer, it took a long time before the Moderna was then approved for the adolescents. There was a big gap there, even though the two studies were basically a month apart from each other. And that's been true throughout this, is that the Moderna is basically a month behind Pfizer, partly because the two doses are spaced 4 weeks apart instead of 3 weeks apart. So the issue, though, is that when you get to FDA to get approved, they go through this process that's called emergency use authorization. And all the vaccines have so far been approved or authorized initially as emergency use. And then after they're used for a while and more experience is gathered, then it moves on to full approval. One of the criteria for getting emergency use authorization is that there's no other option. So once the Pfizer gets approved or authorized first, then you already get a knockdown from Moderna because now there's another option. And so the urgency with which the agency works to then authorize the second type of vaccine goes way down. And that's my understanding for why there was a big lag between when the Pfizer was authorized for adolescents and when Moderna was authorized for adolescents. So even though that's not maybe what we want to hear as consumers, that's the way the agency works. And so I suspect that's going to be true again for the younger kids. So unless for some reason, and maybe there's reason to hope for that, that maybe the Moderna pediatric vaccine will show a lot higher efficacy than the Pfizer. And that may be the case. It's a totally, they have a totally different vaccine that's got totally different dosing. And if that's the case, now that we know that the Pfizer has been only 12% effective for that age group, if Moderna comes through and says even during Omicron it's been much more effective, then maybe that would get pushed through faster. But I honestly haven't heard any projections for when that's coming.
And then the last question I have, and I don't know if you can answer this, but do you think preschools and schools will or should require the COVID vaccine?
Right. Stepping into controversial territory here. I think that schools should be brave, and I think schools should do the right thing. And what we know from history is that vaccines have saved more lives than just about any other medical technology and medical advancement in modern times. And it, they're scrutinized more highly than any other kind of drug out there. The standards for safety testing are extraordinarily high. So I would just say that we should be brave and we should be leaders and say vaccines save lives. They protect the community. They are a public health measure that protect the vulnerable among us. And we should be brave and say that's the right thing to do. So that's my personal opinion.
Thank you so much, Dr. King. Does anybody else have any more questions? If you don't want to put them in the chat, you're more than welcome to unmute and ask. And if not, I just want to thank you so much, Dr. King, for coming tonight. I found this incredibly informative for my own kids. So I really do appreciate that. We did record this, so if any of you know of someone who was hoping to be here tonight but couldn't, please let them know that we will be sending out the recording.
Well, thank you for inviting me and hope everyone stays well.
Thank you so much.